Mark Levin has spent decades building a reputation as one of conservative media's most aggressive and uncompromising voices. His radio show reaches millions of listeners daily, and his television program on Fox News gives him a platform to launch devastating attacks on Democratic politicians. Known for his shouting delivery, his willingness to use inflammatory language, and his absolute certainty that progressive policies represent an existential threat to America, Levin has made a career out of demolishing his political opponents with relentless verbal assaults that leave little room for response or nuance. When Levin decided to dedicate multiple segments across his radio and television shows to attacking Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, he clearly believed he had found a perfect target. A freshman Democrat from Texas who had gained national attention through viral confrontations with Republicans, Crockett seemed like someone Levin could easily portray as the embodiment of everything wrong with the modern Democratic Party. He prepared what he thought would be a comprehensive takedown that would damage her credibility and serve as a warning to other progressive politicians about the cost of challenging conservative positions. What Levin failed to anticipate was that Jasmine Crockett would not simply absorb his attacks and move on. Instead, she crafted a response so thorough, so devastating, and so precisely targeted at the weaknesses in Levin's arguments that it effectively neutralized his ability to continue attacking her without appearing foolish. The response went viral across political media, earning praise even from some conservative commentators who acknowledged that Levin had badly miscalculated. It marked a turning point where one of conservative media's most feared voices discovered that the old tactics of overwhelming opponents with volume and aggression no longer guaranteed victory. Before we examine exactly what Levin said, how Crockett responded, and why her comeback was so effective that it essentially ended his ability to credibly attack her, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to this channel for continued coverage of these critical political battles. Now let us break down how Jasmine Crockett delivered a final response that left Mark Levin with no effective counter, and demonstrated that even the most aggressive conservative voices can be defeated with preparation, precision, and unwavering commitment to truth. Mark Levin occupies a unique position in conservative media as someone who bridges traditional talk radio and modern cable television. His radio program has been on air for nearly 2 decades, building a devoted audience that appreciates his combative style and his framing of political debates as existential struggles between constitutional conservatism and what he characterizes as socialist tyranny. His television show on Fox News brings that same energy to a visual medium, complete with theatrical gestures, raised voice, and an intensity that makes clear he views political disagreements as matters of fundamental principle rather than policy preferences. Levin's approach to political commentary relies heavily on several key tactics. He speaks with absolute certainty about complex issues, presenting his interpretations as obvious truths that only fools or liars would dispute. He questions the motives and patriotism of his opponents rather than simply disagreeing with their positions. He uses inflammatory language designed to provoke emotional reactions from his audience, framing Democrats not as people with different policy ideas, but as active threats to American freedom and prosperity. He rarely engages with the strongest versions of opposing arguments, instead constructing strawman positions that are easier to demolish. This approach has proven highly successful in building and maintaining a loyal audience. Levin's listeners and viewers appreciate his willingness to say things that other conservative commentators might soften or qualify. They respond to his certainty in an uncertain world, and his framing of political battles in moral rather than merely tactical terms. For Levin, the business model depends on maintaining his image as a fearless warrior for conservative principles who will not back down or compromise in the face of liberal opposition. Jasmine Crockett represents exactly the kind of political figure that Levin's audience has been conditioned to view with suspicion and hostility. She is young, black, female, progressive, and unapologetic about her positions on issues like voting rights, criminal justice reform, and economic inequality. Her viral moments in Congress show her directly challenging Republican colleagues and refusing to accept what she views as bad faith arguments. For someone like Levin, she appears to embody everything his audience has been taught to oppose. However, Levin's understanding of Crockett was based primarily on short video clips and superficial characterizations rather than actual familiarity with her background, expertise, or strategic approach to political communication. He knew she was a progressive Democrat who had gone viral for confrontational moments. He did not know or did not care that she was a trained attorney with extensive courtroom experience, that her confrontational moments were typically strategic rather than emotional, and that she had developed sophisticated skills for dismantling bad faith arguments through her years as a public defender and civil rights lawyer. The stakes of this confrontation extended beyond the personal reputations of Levin and Crockett. At issue was whether conservative media figures could continue to attack progressive politicians with impunity, confident that their platforms and audiences gave them inherent advantages that made substantive responses impossible or ineffective. Crockett's ability to respond effectively would demonstrate whether the old model of one-directional media attacks was still viable in an era when politicians could communicate directly with millions of people through social media and alternative platforms. For the Democratic Party more broadly, The confrontation represented a test of whether their members could stand up to aggressive conservative media attacks without becoming defensive or appearing weak. Too often, Democratic politicians had responded to attacks from figures like Levin either by ignoring them entirely, which allowed the attacks to stand unchallenged, or by issuing bland statements that failed to engage with the substance of the criticisms. Crockett had an opportunity to model a different approach, one that met aggression with strength while remaining grounded in facts and substance. The timing of Levin's attacks was also significant. Crockett had recently gained substantial attention for her confrontations with Republican senators and her effective media appearances. She was emerging as a prominent voice for progressive positions and as someone who could communicate those positions effectively to broad audiences. Levin's attacks were designed to undercut that emerging prominence, to plant doubts about her credibility and competence before she could become too established as a national political figure. Mark Levin's attacks on Jasmine Crockett began on his radio show and quickly expanded to his television program. The initial radio segment ran nearly 15 minutes, an unusually long focus on a single freshman member of Congress. Levin opened by playing clips of Crockett's questions during a recent committee hearing, but the clips were edited to remove context and make her questions appear more confrontational and less substantive than they actually were. He used his trademark raised voice to mock her tone and approach, suggesting that she was more interested in creating viral moments than in serious legislative work. Levin then moved to what he characterized as the substance of Crockett's positions. He claimed that her support for criminal justice reform demonstrated that she was soft on crime and more concerned with protecting criminals than with supporting law enforcement or crime victims. He suggested that her background as a public defender had given her a warped perspective that made her unsuitable for making laws. He questioned why voters would trust someone who had spent years defending people accused of crimes to now write the rules that determine what counts as criminal behavior. The attack escalated as Levin moved to Crockett's positions on voting rights. He characterized her advocacy for expanded voting access as an attempt to make it easier to commit voter fraud. He suggested that her claims about voter suppression were fabricated or wildly exaggerated, designed to justify federal takeover of state election systems. He accused her of playing the race card by connecting voting restrictions to racial discrimination, arguing that election security measures apply equally to all voters regardless of race. Levin saved his most aggressive attacks for Crockett's economic positions. He characterized her support for expanded social programs as socialist ideology that would destroy the American economy. He suggested that she and other progressive Democrats wanted to punish success and redistribute wealth from hardworking Americans to people who refused to take responsibility for their own lives. He questioned her understanding of basic economics and suggested that her positions reflected either ignorance or a deliberate desire to harm American prosperity. Throughout these attacks, Levin employed several rhetorical techniques designed to maximize impact. He spoke with absolute confidence, presenting his characterizations as obvious facts rather than debatable interpretations. He questioned Crockett's motives rather than simply disagreeing with her positions, suggesting that she knew her policies would harm America but pursued them anyway for political gain. He used emotionally loaded language, describing her positions as dangerous, radical, and anti-American rather than simply wrong or misguided. The attacks continued across multiple broadcasts, with Levin returning to Crockett repeatedly as an example of what he characterized as the dangerous direction of the Democratic Party. He encouraged his audience to share clips of his commentary, helping to spread his attacks beyond his immediate listener and viewer base. Conservative websites and social media accounts amplified the attacks, creating a coordinated narrative about Crockett as a radical extremist whose positions posed a threat to American values and prosperity. Some conservative commentators joined Levin's attacks, adding their own critiques of Crockett and treating Levin's characterizations as established facts rather than partisan opinions. The cumulative effect was a sustained campaign designed to damage Crockett's reputation and credibility, particularly among moderate and independent voters who might not be familiar with her actual record and positions. The strategy was one that had worked many times before for Levin and other conservative media figures, creating narratives about Democratic politicians that became difficult to dislodge even when factually inaccurate. As the attacks intensified, pressure mounted on Crockett to respond. Some Democratic strategists advised ignoring Levin entirely, arguing that responding would only amplify his attacks and give them more oxygen. Others suggested a brief statement rebutting the most egregious falsehoods but otherwise moving on. Still others argued for a comprehensive response that would engage with each of Levin's claims and expose the dishonesty underlying them. Crockett herself recognized that this moment required a carefully calibrated response. Ignoring the attacks would allow Levin's characterizations to potentially take root among voters who were not familiar with her actual record. A weak response would make her appear unable to defend herself and her positions, but an overly aggressive or emotional response would play into stereotypes and allow Levin to claim that he had gotten under her skin. The challenge was to craft a response that was forceful enough to neutralize the attacks while remaining substantive and grounded in facts. The response strategy that Crockett ultimately chose reflected her legal training and her understanding of how to dismantle bad faith arguments. Rather than issuing a brief statement or matching Levin's aggressive tone, she decided to produce a detailed point-by-point rebuttal that would expose the factual inaccuracies and logical fallacies in his attacks. She would not just defend herself but would go on offense, examining Levin's credibility and the techniques he used to mislead his audience. The goal was not just to rebut this particular set of attacks, but to inoculate herself against future attacks by demonstrating that she could and would respond effectively to dishonest characterizations. Jasmine Crockett's response came in the form of a carefully produced video that ran approximately 12 minutes, longer than typical political response videos but necessary to comprehensively address the range of attacks Levin had made. The video was released simultaneously across all her social media platforms and was picked up quickly by political media outlets. From the opening seconds, it was clear that this would be a different kind of political response, one that combined the thoroughness of a legal brief with the communication effectiveness of skilled political messaging. Crockett began by noting that Levin had spent hours across multiple broadcasts attacking her character, her record, and her positions. She thanked him for the attention and noted that many people who had not previously been familiar with her work were now interested in learning more about her actual positions and record. This opening reframed the dynamic immediately, suggesting that Levin's attacks might actually benefit her by raising her profile and creating opportunities to communicate directly with new audiences. She then moved systematically through each of Levin's major attacks, beginning with his characterization of her criminal justice reform positions. Crockett explained that supporting reform was not about being soft on crime, but about making the justice system more effective at actually reducing crime and increasing public safety. She cited specific research showing that many current sentencing practices do not improve public safety, and in some cases make communities less safe by destabilizing families and creating barriers to employment for people who have served their sentences. She addressed Levin's attack on her background as a public defender by explaining the constitutional basis for the right to counsel and the importance of that right to a fair justice system. She noted that John Adams, revered by conservatives as a founding father, had defended British soldiers accused of murder in the Boston Massacre. She asked whether Levin believed Adams was soft on crime or whether he understood that defending the accused was essential to justice. The comparison was devastating because it used conservative reverence for the founders to validate the very work Levin had attacked. Crockett then turned to voting rights, where Levin's attacks had been particularly aggressive. She presented data from multiple sources showing that the voting restrictions Levin defended did in fact have disparate impacts based on race. She cited court decisions that had found discriminatory intent behind some of these restrictions. She noted that Levin had provided no evidence of widespread voter fraud that would justify the restrictions, and she challenged him to present such evidence if he had it. She explained that expanding voting access was about ensuring that all eligible citizens could exercise their constitutional rights, not about facilitating fraud. On economic policy, Crockett provided a detailed explanation of her actual positions, which was significantly more moderate and nuanced than the socialist caricature Levin had presented. She explained which social programs she supported and how they would be funded. She cited economic research on the returns from public investment in areas like education and infrastructure. She noted that many of the programs she supported had bipartisan backing in opinion polls, even if they faced partisan opposition in Congress. She demonstrated that her positions were grounded in economic evidence rather than ideology. Throughout these substantive rebuttals, Crockett maintained a calm, professional tone that contrasted sharply with Levin's shouting delivery. She presented evidence for each of her points, citing specific sources that viewers could verify themselves. She acknowledged complexities and trade-offs rather than pretending that policy choices were simple or obvious. The contrast between her measured, fact-based approach and Levin's emotional, evidence-free attacks was striking and effective, but Crockett did not stop at defending herself and her positions. She went on offense against Levin himself, examining his credibility and his methods. She noted that he had edited her committee hearing clips to remove context, and she showed the unedited versions to demonstrate how the editing had changed their meaning. She pointed out that he had mischaracterized her positions on multiple issues, describing views she did not hold and then attacking those strawman positions rather than engaging with her actual arguments. She then did something particularly effective. She examined other instances where Levin had made factually inaccurate claims about political figures and issues, demonstrating a pattern of dishonesty rather than isolated errors. She showed clips of Levin making predictions that had proven completely wrong, promoting conspiracy theories that had been debunked, and characterizing events in ways that contradicted documented facts. She was not just defending herself against this particular attack but was undermining Levin's credibility more broadly. Crockett concluded her response by addressing Levin's audience directly. She noted that they deserved commentators who would give them accurate information and engage honestly with opposing arguments, not manipulate them with edited clips and misrepresentations. She said that people could disagree with her positions on the merits, and she welcomed substantive debate about policy differences. But she challenged Levin's audience to demand honesty from their media sources and to verify claims rather than simply accepting them because they confirmed existing beliefs. The final moment of the video was perhaps the most powerful. Crockett looked directly into the camera and said that Mark Levin could continue attacking her if he chose, but that she would respond to every dishonest attack with documented facts and evidence. She said that he could shout louder, but she would speak more clearly. She said that he could edit clips to mislead his audience, but she would provide full context. She made clear that she would not be intimidated or silenced, and that anyone who attacked her dishonestly would face the same kind of thorough, fact-based response. It was a statement of defiance that also served as a warning to other potential attackers. The response to Crockett's video was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, it had been viewed millions of times across various platforms. Political commentators from across the spectrum acknowledged that she had delivered an exceptionally effective rebuttal that went beyond typical political responses. Even some conservative analysts who disagreed with her policies admitted that she had thoroughly dismantled Levin's attacks and exposed the dishonest tactics he had employed. Mark Levin faced an extremely uncomfortable situation. His initial instinct was to double down, to attack Crockett's response as proving his point about her being more interested in media combat than in legislating. But this approach immediately ran into problems. When he tried to claim that her response was all style and no substance, observers pointed to the detailed policy explanations and extensive documentation she had provided. When he tried to dismiss her fact-checking as partisan spin, people noted that she had cited nonpartisan sources and court decisions that could be independently verified. Levin's credibility took a significant hit when fact-checkers and media critics began examining the specific claims that Crockett had challenged. Multiple outlets confirmed that Levin had indeed edited clips in misleading ways, had mischaracterized Crockett's positions, and had made claims without evidence. Some of the past inaccuracies that Crockett had highlighted also received renewed attention, creating a broader narrative about Levin's reliability as a source of information. For someone whose authority depended on his audience trusting that he was telling them the truth, this was damaging. Conservative media figures found themselves in an awkward position regarding the Levin-Crockett exchange. Many disagreed with Crockett's policies and would have preferred to support Levin's attacks on her. But her response had been so thorough and so well documented that defending Levin required either ignoring the evidence she had presented or engaging in obviously dishonest spin. Most chose to simply move on to other topics rather than wade into a debate where Crockett had established such strong factual ground. The impact on Levin's ability to attack Crockett in the future was significant. Having been so thoroughly rebutted once, any subsequent attacks would invite immediate fact-checking and comparisons to his previous dishonesty. His audience had seen that Crockett was prepared and willing to respond comprehensively to attacks, which meant that future attacks carried the risk of backfiring similarly. Effectively, Crockett had inoculated herself against Levin's attacks by demonstrating that she would not be an easy or consequence-free target. For other progressive politicians, Crockett's response provided a template for how to handle aggressive conservative media attacks. The key lessons were clear. Respond comprehensively rather than briefly, provide extensive documentation for claims, expose dishonest tactics rather than just defending against specific attacks, maintain a professional tone even when addressing aggressive critics, and go on offense against the credibility of dishonest attackers. Several Democratic members of Congress began adopting similar approaches when they faced media attacks. The exchange also had implications for how conservative media figures approached attacks on Democratic politicians. The realization that their targets might respond effectively and publicly damage their credibility created new calculations about risk and reward. Attacking politicians who might not respond or might respond weakly remained safe. But attacking someone like Crockett, who had demonstrated both the capability and willingness to fight back effectively, became more dangerous. This shift in dynamics gave some Democratic politicians more breathing room and reduced the volume of bad faith attacks they faced. Democratic Party communications strategists studied Crockett's response extensively, identifying elements that could be incorporated into training for other members and candidates. The combination of thorough fact-checking, clear communication, and strategic offense against dishonest critics represented best practices that could be taught and replicated. The party began investing more resources in rapid response capabilities that would allow other members to craft similarly effective rebuttals when they faced attacks. Media critics and journalism organizations used the Levin-Crockett exchange as a case study in media manipulation and effective response. The edited clips that Levin had used became examples in media literacy training of how selective editing can distort meaning. Crockett's point-by-point rebuttal with extensive documentation became an example of how public figures could effectively combat misinformation. The exchange was taught in college courses on political communication and media studies. For Jasmine Crockett personally, the successful response to Levin further elevated her profile and solidified her reputation as someone who could not be easily attacked or dismissed. Her demonstrated ability to stand up to one of conservative media's most aggressive voices made her valuable to Democratic leadership and attractive to progressive organizations looking for effective spokespeople. The exchange became a highlight of her political resume, evidence of both her communication skills and her willingness to fight back against dishonest attacks. The broader implications for political discourse were mixed. On one hand, Crockett's response showed that dishonest media attacks could be effectively countered, which was encouraging for those who value factual accuracy in political debate. On the other hand, the amount of time and resources required to craft such a comprehensive response was substantial, and not every politician had the resources or skills to replicate her success. The exchange highlighted both the possibility of fighting back against misinformation and the difficulty of doing so effectively. Some observers noted that the real problem was that figures like Levin could make dishonest attacks in the first place without facing consequences from their platforms or their audiences. Crockett's response was effective for her personally, but it did not prevent Levin from continuing to attack other political figures using similar tactics. The structural problem of partisan media environments where dishonesty was rewarded rather than punished remained unresolved. Nevertheless, the exchange represented a significant moment in the evolution of political communication. It demonstrated that the old model where conservative media figures could attack democratic politicians with impunity was breaking down. Politicians who were skilled communicators with access to social media platforms could fight back effectively, turning attacks into opportunities and damaging the credibility of dishonest critics. This shift in power dynamics had implications for how political battles would be fought in the future. The long-term impact on Mark Levin's influence and credibility continues to unfold. While he retained his loyal audience, his ability to shape broader narratives and influence persuadable voters was diminished. His attacks on other political figures were met with more skepticism, with observers quick to fact-check his claims and challenge his characterizations. He had learned that not all targets were equally vulnerable and that some politicians would fight back in ways that could damage him more than his attacks damaged them. For American political discourse more broadly, the exchange offered both hope and caution. Hope that dishonest attacks could be effectively countered with facts and evidence, and that politicians who took the time to respond thoroughly could protect themselves and inform the public. Caution that the resources and skills required for such responses were not universally available, and that the burden of combating misinformation fell heavily on those being attacked rather than on the platforms and audiences that enabled the attacks in the first place. If you want to continue following how political figures are adapting their communication strategies in response to attacks from partisan media, and how the balance of power in political discourse continues to evolve, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. The confrontation between Mark Levin and Jasmine Crockett represents a turning point where aggressive conservative media voices discovered that their old tactics no longer guaranteed success. Crockett's response demonstrated that thorough preparation, factual accuracy, and strategic communication could defeat even the most aggressive attacks. The lessons from this exchange will shape political communication for years to come, as both attackers and targets adjust their strategies based on what happened when one of conservative media's loudest voices targeted the wrong opponent and paid the price for his dishonesty. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video.